Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's post-Thanksgiving podcast, I have projects on the needles, a lot of projects. So let's get started. About a year ago, I finished up a sweater that was part of my decades project. It's this long-term project to knit a sweater from each decade from the 1890s to the 1990s. So it took me about 4 years. And during that time, I also knit 3 other sweaters that had nothing to do with that. And those are ones that I either reverse engineered from a commercially knit sweater or that I designed myself. So it's a lot of sweaters in that 4-year time period. And I knit, other things too. I am an avid sock knitter, and every once in a while I'll find a hat or some other kind of accessory or whatever that I'll knit as well. But mostly for me, it's sweaters and socks. And a year ago when I finished up that project, and I wasn't thinking about, well, what sweater I'm going to knit for the next decade. I didn't have a next decade. I finished that and I was a little burned out on sweaters, and I really didn't have an idea for what I was going to knit next. And so I looked in this bin that I keep in my desk where I can throw my work in progress. And sometimes a work in progress turns into a UFO that I'll forget about. But by opening that bin up, I'll be reminded that it's in there. And also, I've been working on my UFO pile for the past, 6, 7 years or whatever, because I'm very out of sight, out of mind. And so I might get tired of something or mad at something and stick it in a drawer somewhere or a bin or a bag or a box, and then just forget it exists. So like 7 years ago, I took out every UFO that I had, and there was more than 40 of them, and I couldn't believe it. And so I spent a lot of that year working on those UFOs. And then in 2018, I decided to do Finish It February, so that every year in February, I would just pull out all of those things and look at what I'd put to the side. Was this something I still liked? Was it something I didn't care about anymore, or was I kind of ambivalent about it? But just to remind myself of what was there. And a lot of times I would be delighted to see, oh, I forgot all about this. And then I got to the point where if I got really mad at something, I'd made some big screw up on a project and I was just so mad at it, I would put it in the timeout. I would know that I would look at it again in February and I wouldn't forget about it or just say, oh, I'll do that someday. I have this defined time period where I will look at it. And I also use it as a time to fix things, like if I get a hole in an elbow or I need to put new buttons on, or if I want to do a different neck in a sweater, like I don't like this neck, I want to redo it. I would use February for doing that. So I just done that so consistently, and I'd come up with systems for staying on top of my unfinished projects that a year ago when I finished this really long project, I didn't have anything else to knit. And I was a little panicked about that. And I realized I really do need to have a couple of different things on the needles. That really would be helpful to me. So that if I finish something and I'm not sure what I'm going to knit next, that there would be something ready for me. I'm not much of a yarn stasher. I do have sock yarn stash. I have tons of leftovers, and I have yarn where I just bought more than I needed. So I do have some stash. If I think of a project that only takes one skein, maybe I'll have enough, I'll have the right yarn for it. But most of the time, if I'm especially a sweater, or a gift for somebody and I want them to have the yarn that they want, I'm going to go out and buy that. So that takes a little planning. I can't just start it. I started a new long-term project then, which was evolution of stockings. And so I was knitting stockings from different centuries, and that was really interesting. And I was doing one after another. But again, it wasn't like accumulating extra projects. I was just doing one stocking after another. And I got a little burned out on that in the summer. I kind of wanted to do something else. So this fall, I've been knitting a few different, like just small project accessories. And some of those I have been able to use stashed yarn because you know, they take 100 grams or less, and I would have the yarn on hand to do that. And I've been using, you know, contemporary patterns, not vintage patterns, or not descriptions of something that, you know, where I have to do all of the calculations. I've just been using these patterns. Most of them have needed some sort of modification because there's either been errors or, you know, just things that are a little hinky about them. So a few weeks ago, I got this box of variegated yarn from Arcane Fiberworks, and it was like 25 skeins. There was 8 skeins that were in one colorway. It was like a sweater quantity, and then everything else was different colorways, various yarn weights in single colorways. And I hadn't worked in variegated yarn for a long time. And so I've been kind of reacquainting myself with that and trying to think of projects to use that for. Then another thing was, you know, I started wearing my sweaters again, and I've gone down a size since last spring when I was having health issues, and I changed, made some lifestyle changes. So I changed my dietary pattern. I didn't go on a diet, I just changed my dietary pattern. I'm doing a plant-based Mediterranean diet. I'm eating all I want to eat. I'm not restricting my calories. And I started exercising, and then just gradually I've just lost weight. And so I put my sweaters on. I'm like, everything's just a little too big. It's still wearable, but everything feels a little sloppy on me. And so I decided it's been a year, I'm ready to knit a new sweater. And so I looked in my Ravelry queue, and I've had a sweater in there called the Royale Pullover for 11 years. I bought the pattern in 2012. I loved it. And I've kept it in my queue. I don't use my Ravelry queue really as a planning, like, here's what I'm going to knit next, and here's what I'm going to knit after that. It's just like, these are patterns I really like and I would like to knit someday. And so finally, that someday is today for the Royale Pullover. So I've got this box of variegated yarn I'm trying to figure out things for. I need a couple of new sweaters, and so I've got my first one on the needles for that. And then, because we take walks in the evening, my husband and I, and it's Minnesota and it's getting colder, you know, we Minnesotans have a way, at least we do in our house, of every 10 degrees colder it gets, then there's a different type of glove or mitten or scarf or hat or coat that you're going to put on. You know, gets to be a point where, okay, now it's time for the long underwear. Okay, now it's time for the snow pants, like if it's really cold, like 20 below or something. So we have all of these different layers, and I've been thinking as we've been going on our walks, like what kind of winter accessories I might want to knit for myself that will help me with these longer walks. Because it's not just like, oh, I just have to go out to the car or from the car to a park, you know, across a parking lot. Like, we're outside for 30 or 40 minutes walking, and that keeps you warm to some extent. But, you know, I'm thinking about what I can knit in self-defense. So I've got some projects in mind. Some I've started, and some are on the near horizon. So I'm going to go to the overhead and kind of show you what's in progress. I was really putting the brakes on these 2 little sweaters I was knitting for my grandnephew and grandniece, because I didn't know what I was going to knit next. And so I kind of stopped working on them so that I could start working on several other things and get things planned so that I can know a little bit in the future what I'm going to do. I don't know that other knitters have this issue. Like, do some of you have this where you don't know what you're going to, like, you want to knit, you don't know what you're going to knit next, and maybe you don't have any UFOs. I know there are knitters out there who work on one project until it's done, and then they work on the next one. And I do that to some extent, like, but my tolerance is about 3 weeks, or, you know, maybe I get bored or I get frustrated, I have a problem and I want to put it to the side and work on something else. So I do kind of focus myself, I tend to, in 3-week amounts for larger projects. Some projects only take a couple of days though. So for those, I'm just wondering if there's anybody out there who's kind of like me, and what your strategy is to not run out of things to knit. I don't know that anyone's got my particular set of weird circumstances, but I'd love to hear your ideas for how you plan, because I can't plan too many projects ahead because I will find something else new and interesting before that happens. So I need to be able to plan maybe just one or two ahead so that I can get the yarn I need for it. So let's go to the overhead and I can show you what I'm working on, and then I will show you this Royale pullover I'm working on because I had an issue. I finished the sleeve yesterday and I had an issue with it, and I'm going to show you how I solved that problem because it's something I'd never tried before. I'd never needed to do before, never thought to do before, and I didn't know if it was going to work. And I decided to do it on camera, which I don't usually try to figure things out on camera. So let's go to the overhead. This is something I finally finished. I started this back in August. I designed it starting with the bottom-up seamless raglan that's in this particular book, the Knitter's Handy Book of Sweater Patterns by Ann Budd. I wanted to have a sweater where I could demonstrate a number of different techniques that I could use in some Technique Tuesday videos, and I've been doing that. I have a couple more videos that will be coming out in the future that are related to the sweater. The most recent technique video was, I think, last week, where I showed how to close, graft the underarm stitches and then end up without having holes at either side. So that was the most recent video that featured this particular sweater. I'm not convinced that a toddler, they have large heads in proportion to their body. Toddlers don't have heads that are that much smaller than an adult. I don't know that I could get this over my head. So I might send this to my niece to see if her daughter can get her head through here. But this is the dimensions that were listed in the pattern for the smallest size, and I'm just not sure a kid could fit their head through there. It served its purpose for demonstration purposes. The next thing is not finished, and you've seen this a few times before. It's the sweater for my grandnephew Henry. I still need to put the collar on. This one will be the next thing that actually gets finished, will be this particular sweater. So while I was taking a break from Henry's sweater, I started working on his sister's sweater, Rosie, and I'm knitting this cardigan. And I'll be talking more about this cardigan and the patterns and some of the modifications I made in a future video. But I've got the body done, one sleeve done. I've picked up stitches for the second sleeve. I'm also going to still have to do the neckband and then the button bands, and I have to find buttons for this. So that's something I will be working on in the next week is figuring out the buttons for this and hopefully get this further along. I don't know if it'll be done in the next week, but hopefully it'll be done by the next Casual Friday. I'd really like to show you a number of finished things next time. So that's getting close to the finish, but still a little bit of time left. And now this is the point where I was like, I just want more things on my needles before I finish anything. The thing that I decided to start next was a pair of gloves. So these are going to be what we call liner gloves here in Minnesota, which is they're gloves that you wear inside of a pair of mittens. So you have extra warmth, and then if you need to take your mitten off to do something that requires some dexterity, you aren't going to get your fingers frozen off while you're doing that. So we've been taking walks in the evening since this past spring, and we want to continue doing it, and it's very dark and it's starting to get colder out, and I'm thinking about my extra layers that I want. And so I thought I want to make myself a pair of liner gloves and then a pair of mittens to wear over them. I've made thrummed mittens in the past, and what I find is that the thrums kind of felt up into little clumps and then they leave gaps, so they're not as warm as you'd think they'd be. And so what I wanted to do was make a pair of stranded colorwork mittens, so that would be another 2 layers of yarn and would be in a heavier yarn. And then I wanted the cuff, instead of sitting against my wrist, that it would come up over my parka. So the plan is to use the construction method and the dimensions of mittens that you can find in this book. Most of them have this kind of construction in here. And a lot of these have multiple colors. I'm just going to be using 2 colors. I'm going to be using these 2. This is some Zwartbles yarn that I got a number of years ago. I bought it from a shepherd in Ireland. It's Zwartbles, Ireland, Suzanne. And she gets this yarn made at the mill in her county. And I bought it from her as a birthday gift for myself and made myself a sweater using it. But I have, a couple extra skeins. And then I have this 2-ounce ball of worsted weight Kiviot. A lot of Kiviot comes in a lace weight, and people make these little, they call them smoke ring type of things that are really warm. But I have this worsted weight, and it's not, you could make a pretty skimpy hat with it, but I've been trying for a few years to figure out what to do with it. And so what I think I'm going to do is to combine these 2 into a strand of colorwork mitt. So at least the hand will have stranded colorwork on it with the Kiviot. So the Kiviot's really warm. And then I'll wear these inside those. And hopefully that will be warm enough to battle the Minnesota winters. Usually knitted mittens, I don't find, if I'm spending time outside, are not warm enough. Even when I've done thrummed mittens, I still have to have something else inside them. So this is just something that I want to try because I've been wanting to use this for a few years. This is leftover. I've got a couple of hanks of this still. And then this yarn is one of the variegated skeins that I got from Arcane Fiberworks a few weeks ago. So I've got this box of yarn in all different colorways I'm trying to figure out what to do with. And so I thought, I'll make a pair of gloves. And this is the S'more Please colorway. So it's got the graham cracker color, the toasted marshmallow color, and then the chocolate bar colors in there. Because there were liner gloves and I wasn't sure how this variegated yarn was going to play out, I thought it was a perfect experiment. So I've also been looking at his videos to see how he dyes his different colorways, because he does different techniques for different colorways, which I think end up playing out differently in the project. And a lot also depends on the width or circumference of the thing that you are knitting. So you can see here that I've kind of got some spirals here in the cuff, and then you get to the hand where I start working increases, and it's playing out differently here. And then in the fingers, which are much smaller circumference, couple inches around, you get these thin little stripes. And I'm really happy that I get stripes, the same kinds of stripes in each of these. That's really nice. So this first one was an experiment because I hadn't made gloves in a long time. And I kind of knew I wanted to make them either with no ease or with slight amount of negative ease. And I started with a provisional cast on here because I wasn't sure how much yarn it was going to take and then how much I would want to use for the cuff. So I decided to do the cuff later. And what I decided was I pretty much like the fit. There's a couple of things I would do differently. One is the hand is just a little bit roomy. I'd like it just a little bit snugger. So I want a few, fewer stitches for the hand. And that means that when I'm working the fingers, I have to do something a little bit different than I did on the first one. And then the other thing was I thought that the thumb was a little bit too short. I found that in order to get something that fits me the way I want, I need to work the finger to the actual length and then do these 2 decrease rounds. So it seems like they end up longer, but even though I'm knitting these to the circumference of my finger, the inside circumference of these tubes is a little bit smaller. So it's actually causing things to stretch a little bit, which shortens them. So that was, something I was wanting to sort of refresh my memory on and just figure out what kind of fit I actually like. So I pretty much like the fit. I'll probably take this thumb out. I think I have enough yarn to take that out, add a couple of more rounds, and then fasten it off. I'm not going to worry about this being a little bit too roomy in the hand back here. Like I said, these are liner gloves. What I am doing is for the second one, this one I have 64 stitches in the cuff. I've got 56 in this one, and I decided to use a smaller needle for the cuff just to make that a little snugger because I just want it to be close around my wrist. So if we try this one on, I like this fit a little better. I just like the closer fit on this. So I'm going to start with the 56, and then I'll work my hand, and then I'm going to have to adjust the fingers a little bit. And I can talk about this more in the future. Not a lot of people knit gloves. I mean, some people do, so I don't know how interesting this is to people to understand how this process works, because to me, this is like knitting a basic sock. If this is something that you like to do, that to learn the formula, and then like sort of the process, and then how to figure out how to make gloves for a specific person, especially if they have odd hands. So some people might have a really large hand but short fingers, or they might have a small hand and large, they just might not fit the patterns very well. And so understanding how this kind of thing works, I think, is really helpful. I learned from a written tutorial online years ago that is no longer available. I'd point you to that tutorial if you're interested in gloves, if it still existed, and I would have consulted it myself prior to knitting these if it still existed. It's too bad that it doesn't. So one of the things that I thought was interesting about this Royale pullover sweater was that they call for knitting the sleeves first. Now, a lot of knitters do this anyway. When you are knitting a sweater in pieces, whether you're knitting it seamlessly or flat, the basic order of construction is the back and then the fronts. If it's a cardigan, you have two fronts, and then the sleeves, and then the neck, and then the button bands. That's typically the order of progression. If you're working it in the round, then you'd work the body up to the underarms, and then you'd finish the back, and then you'd do the two fronts, and then you'd do the sleeves. And many knitters who maybe dislike doing gauge swatches will start with the sleeve, because they'll use that as a gauge swatch, just to confirm that they like the sizing that they're expecting to get and the fit. And if their gauge is off, then they'll rip it out and change the needle. And so they just use that as a gauge swatch. And if they got the needle right, then they can just continue. As with a gauge swatch, if you get the needle wrong, then you have to re-swatch until you get the right needle, and then you can cast on. When I'm using a yarn like what I'm using here, which is Cascade 220, I've used this so many times. I know what needle size I need to get a stockinette gauge. This sweater has no stockinette, and so the gauge is given in this twisted moss stitch. So instead of knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, you're doing knit through the back loop, purl one, knit through the back loop, purl one. Let me get closer. So you can, this is a heathered yarn. It makes it a little harder to see, but these are twisted stitches here. One of the things about traveling twisted stitch patterns like this is that typically you're going to have cable or these twisted knit stitches. Something's going to be moving on just about every round. Sometimes you can have a round where nothing is moving, and that's fine when you're working in the round, but when you're working flat, it can be a little bit of a headache. And so of course you have the sleeve caps that you have to knit flat, and then anything above the underarm is going to be knit flat. But when I got the pattern, I started reading it, I realized that the cable patterns that she chose for this sweater, or maybe she designed them or modified them, but wrong side rows are like other cable patterns where you just knit your knits and purl your purls. So you might have to purl through the back loop and knit normally on the back instead because of the twisted stitches, but you don't have to cross anything on the back. And that's something that's always really difficult for me anyway, I'm much more likely to make a mistake because you can't really see what the cables are doing on the back side, but you can see if you have a knit stitch or a purl stitch. So I was really happy with that, but I've had this pattern for 11 years and then never made it. And so I thought I'm going to start with the sleeve as well, because I do like working sweaters in pieces, and often I will knit them flat, bottom up, and I don't mind seaming. I just like working with smaller pieces. And I really didn't want to start this body is knit in the round, which makes sense, but it's a lot of stitches. And it's a lot of stitches while also trying to learn the cable patterns. By working the sleeve first, you only have to learn one cable. There's two cable patterns, cable panel A and cable panel B. And this is cable panel A. It has 3 little cables in it, but it's panel A. On the body, you're going to have panel A, panel B, panel A again on the front and on the back. This was a good opportunity to really just learn this cable patterns and learn to read my knitting and know when I'd made a mistake and identify that before I got to the body, and then also had cable panel B. So I'll be used to cable panel A. That won't be as much of an issue, and I can focus on cable panel B. I thought I'm going to go ahead and start with the sleeve. She's having that in the pattern, and I like that. So I finished the sleeve yesterday, and this is kind of a form-fitting sleeve. I have a shirt on. I'm going to try it on over my shirt. I don't know that I'm going to wear it over a long sleeve shirt. I might just have it over a camisole. This yarn is pretty soft. It's Peruvian Highland wool, and sometimes it's either certain dye lots or just certain dye colors can make it a little softer. Peruvian Highland wool is a cross between merino and Corriedale. I'm not sure what the percentages are. And Corriedale is a cross between merino and Lincoln long wool. I think it's like 25% Lincoln and 75% merino or something. So Peruvian Highland wool has a lot of merino in it. It's not quite as soft, which is fine with me, but it's also maybe a little bit more durable. I just really, really like it. But you can see how close fitting this is, and part of that is it's cable pattern, so it pulls in a bit like ribbing. It hasn't been washed and blocked yet, so it will relax a little bit. But I'm fine with that, and I might not wear it with the shirt underneath. I might, just have a camisole, so that's already looser on my arm. It feels different. So it would be snug, just a snugger feel with the shirt underneath it, but it would still fit. The problem, you can see I've got a needle in here. The problem is that it's nice and close fitting, but it's tight at the underarm. That bind off chain is very tight. Normally, when I have an underarm, I'll have about 3 inches maybe of underarm bind off, 1.5 inches on each side. And this only has about 2 inches. And then the other issue is they just said to bind off, and I did what I always do when I bind off, is that I bound off in pattern. And this means the majority of the stitches were knit through the back loop, because there's this 2 columns of twisted knits right here, and then you alternate between a twisted knit and a purl on either side. So there were a lot of twisted knits, and that just made the bind off. I just wasn't thinking about it, and this is just too tight. So I'm going to do an experiment, and I'm going to snip the bind off chain right here and then pull that out in either direction. I had 11 stitches that I bound off, so I did 5 stitches, the last 5 stitches of the round here and the first 6 here. And that is because there's actually an odd number of stitches on the needle. There's 1 stitch more in the filler stitch over here than there is at the beginning of the round. And that is just to maintain symmetry with the central panel and then doing the moss stitch on the other side. She just called for an odd number of stitches. And I've had that since the beginning. So even though it was twisted rib at the bottom, it was a modified twisted rib because of these stitch patterns. So it just ended up that it needed an odd number of stitches, and then the extra stitch is in the filler over here. And so at the underarm bind off, that's when I get rid of it. I actually captured 12 stitches. I captured the 6 stitches at the end of the round, and then I captured the 6 stitches at the beginning of the round. And as I said, I have not tried this before, so I'm not sure 100% what's going to happen. If it completely fails, I can just rip the whole sleeve cap back and re-knit it. In order to bind off my 11th stitch, I had to pass it over the 12th stitch. So I just wanted to get that 12th stitch on the needle just in case I needed to. And then what I'm going to do with these stitches is I'm either going to leave them live and graft them to the underarm of the body, and that will probably give it the most stretch. The other option would be to do a type of sewn bind off. There's a few different types of sewn bind offs, but it's the one that June Hemmons Hyatt calls the half hitch bind off. Some people call it the outline stitch bind off. Some people call it stem stitch bind off. There's a lot of names. Essentially, it gives you the same edge that you have with a long tail cast on. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, if leave them live or bind them off in some way. But what I do want to do is take this bind off chain out, and I want to try doing it without ripping everything back. If I have to rip everything back and redo it, fine, but we're going to try this first. I don't usually like to demonstrate things while I'm figuring them out, but I thought, why not? Sometimes my idea works and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes my ideas almost work, and then I get a better idea. Okay, so that stitch got split some. Oh, I don't want to pull that out. Don't do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Go out this way. What's going on here? Oh, there we go. Okay. All right, and then I'm going to have to make sure I've got all the stitches on the needle in the right orientation. This looks like it's twisted. All right, so how many do I have? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then this is the 6. I need another needle. I figured out on this one, oh, I could just pull the chain in, it would pull out, but that's because it was knit in this direction so I could undo it. This was knit in this direction, so I do have to pull it out bit by bit. What's going on here? Let me see. Okay. Where's the chain? There it is. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so that one's all safe. Okay, so I have my 11th. I was able to take that 12th stitch just off the needle, and it was still secure through this. So I have some tails here. They're not too long, but you know, I could either weave these in to secure them away, or I could do a felted join to this length of yarn and then do a outline stitch bind off on here. I don't know if which I'm going to do yet. So what I might do is just leave this and put this on some waste yarn until I get the body done, and then figure out what I want to do with this. So I'll just put that on waste yarn. But that was successful surgery. So, so I'm glad to know that that works. And I'm going to put this on waste yarn and then try it on my arm again and see how that fits. All right, so I tilted my camera up so that you can see with the sleeve I have it on, and I put it on under my arm, and it's very stretchy right here. It's completely stretchy enough, even with this t-shirt on. That's not going to be a problem. So it's just so much stretchier underneath here. It was just such a narrow bind off, and then having it so tight, it was just really uncomfortable. I've never felt that before. A standard bind off chain isn't, it has a little bit of stretch. It's not very stretchy. It's meant to be stable, and having it with the twisted stitches and having it so narrow, it was uncomfortable. So this I can live with. So I still need to think about whether I'm going to graft. I think that might be the best thing, because I with that half hitch bind off, I have a lot of control over how much stretch there is, but without that bind off, I have, you know, I can do a graft, and of course it's not going to be a graft in pattern. So that's another thing to think about. So I don't know yet. We'll find out in the coming weeks what I decide to do about that underarm. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.